Right, so for those of us who reported on and created a lot of content in relation to the unprovoked Israeli attack on Iran last month, we've come in for a lot of accusations of bias in the aftermath of that, usually from Zionists. So there's certainly an argument for why we should take no notice of them and the arguments they're making, especially given the circumstances detailing Iran's right to defend itself. But I thought to myself, if on one hand regime change in Israel is a necessary first step, if Netanyahu's downfall is essential, should I not examine the same line of questioning versus Iran as well? Because on one side, Iran's theocracy do have a track record for atrocities as well, executing protesters and jailing journalists. But on the other, we have Israel's ultra-nationalist coalition, bombing hospitals in Gaza, annexing the West Bank, picking fights with half the region while waving a democracy badge like a forged passport. So both regimes, it can certainly be argued, are crisis factories in light of the atrocities that both do seem to be guilty of. But that still doesn't detract from the fact that only one is killing thousands by the week, igniting regional warfronts like matches and still getting invited to Western summits. So I thought to myself, well, let's have a bit of a devil's advocacy moment here. Israel versus Iran. But the more I thought about it, the question wasn't so much just who falls first, if either of them do at all. It's who needs to and who is likely to. And it's bad news for Benjamin Netanyahu on both fronts, not just because of my own personal feelings, but based on the evidence I found as well. And arguably, it's that conflict with Iran that exposes his desperation and his precarious position the most. Right, so when a government is live streaming a genocide, as we're seeing on social media, destabilising shipping lanes, screaming that the opposition are 5 minutes away from a nuclear weapon, and gutting its own democracy whilst lecturing the world on ethics and morals, perhaps it's time to adjust the regime change priority list here. Western powers are determined Iran must fall, aren't they? But they're pro-Israel, so they would. That doesn't exonerate Iran from domestic violence itself. It does have an appalling track record of executing protesters and journalists and using the death penalty to clamp down on dissent. So for as much as we might be challenged for what I maintain as righteous and unflinching condemnation of Israel for its genocide of Gaza and its other atrocities, notably against Iran, Iran itself is not above reproach either. So if people are going to scream regime change is needed against one or the other, and especially in light of Zionist defences of Israel, which offend me viscerally, I thought I'd take a look at this, and I feel fairly vindicated in my findings as it happens, because there's no doubt that Israel's fall would do more to save lives, calm the region, and shake loose decades of double standards than any revolution in Tehran would. And though no doubt I'll still be accused of bias, I fancy somebody needed to say this, and you might get some anti-Zionist talking points out of this too. Whilst not overtly aligning with another state that certainly does have issues it does need to address and answer for as well. So, the Middle East is fundamentally caught in the throes of two interconnected crises, each driven by regimes facing deep internal dissent as well as mounting external pressure. That is, I think, a perfectly fair point to make. Israel's far-right government under Benjamin Netanyahu and Iran's clerical theocracy led by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Both are in crisis, but in very different ways, profoundly different ways. Israel stands accused of genocide in Gaza, justifiably, mass land theft in the West Bank, and reckless military aggression across the region, including towards Iran. I completely agree with all of that. I think ample evidence exists to back all of that up as well. Iran, meanwhile, suppresses protests at home with brutal crackdowns, mass arrests, and executions, while positioning itself regionally as a reactive power rather than an expansionist aggressor. Evidence exists for all of that as well. Now, much of the global debate surrounding these two states and their futures, we can simply ask about whether or not these regimes survive. It's an often asked question. It's often the framing of much media output on the subject. The West and the US particularly talk about overthrowing the Iranian regime as some kind of necessary move towards stabilization of the Middle East. But I think it's better to be asking a much harder question than that, to reframe the narrative a little bit. If regime change is inevitable or even necessary, what should come first for the greater good of the Middle East then? Cut all the bias out of it. Just look at the facts. Surely that is what cuts to the core of what we all want to see, and that is peace and stability across the Middle East. What would actually achieve that? So this question is not merely academic speculation. It is a moral and strategic imperative, because the consequences of regime change, whether that be in Tehran or Tel Aviv, would reverberate far beyond their national borders. It affects the whole of the Middle East. I would hope we're all in agreement so far. But if Israel's far-right coalition fell tomorrow, would it end the genocide in Gaza and de-escalate conflicts in Lebanon and Yemen? If Iran's theocracy collapsed first, would that bring freedom to its citizens? Or would it instead embolden Israeli aggression and risk plunging Iran into chaos akin to Libya or Iraq after Western-backed interventions? When you drill down into this, these are not simple hypotheticals anymore. They're matters of life and death, aren't they? Shaped about whether hundreds of thousands of people live or perish. So while Iran's repressive theocracy deserves to be held to account for those abuses that there is ample evidence for, the urgency of saving tens of thousands of lives in Gaza and halting the spread of regional war outweighs Iran's domestic oppression. Israel's government is a key driver of regional instability and mass displacement, while Iran's military actions remain primarily reactive. They only got involved when Israel attacked them. So removing Netanyahu's far-right coalition would de-escalate multiple war fronts simultaneously, ease tensions between Arab states and Israel, and potentially force a fundamental shift in Western policy towards the region. Iran's fall, by contrast, carries far greater risks of internal collapse, further regional destabilization, and unintended empowerment of Israel's most hardline factions, whilst opening the way to Western control of Iran via the possible imposition of a new Shah. Goodness knows the son of the last Shah really quite fancies that job, doesn't he? So the first and most pressing argument for prioritising Israeli regime change lies in Gaza, where Israel is committing what human rights groups like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch have been unambiguously calling genocide. Amnesty concludes that Israel's campaign constitutes deliberate and systematic destruction of civilian life and infrastructure. And Human Rights Watch describes the extermination of Gaza's population as acts of genocide under international law. UN human rights experts have warned that Israel is deliberately using starvation as a weapon, with children dying of malnutrition and famine conditions now being widespread. According to UN data, one person in Gaza is being killed every 12 minutes. The human toll is staggering. Over 58,500 Palestinians have now been killed, according to the most recent updated figures cited by UN agencies and human rights organisations, whilst tens of thousands more are being permanently maimed and injured. 80% of Gaza's population is displaced. Entire neighbourhoods have been reduced to rubble. Hospitals, schools, refugee camps have been repeatedly targeted in what international experts increasingly describe as a campaign of mass extermination and ethnic cleansing rather than military necessity. Israel is attempting to erase a people in full view of the international community. And while global powers largely refuse to intervene, it's quite disgusting. So the Gaza genocide is not confined in its consequences to Gaza itself either. It has radicalised populations across the Middle East, and civil unrest has erupted from Cairo to Amman. Egypt's regime faces mounting unrest over its role in keeping the Rafah border closed, fueling accusations that President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is complicit in Israel's starvation tactics. Jordan's monarchy faces growing protests demanding the cancellation of its peace treaty with Israel. Perhaps most significantly, the genocide has energised regional militias, giving groups such as Hezbollah and the Houthis and the Iraqi militias renewed legitimacy as defenders of Gaza. The longer the genocide continues, the more it entrenches cycles of resistance and retaliation across the region, therefore. So the situation in the West Bank adds further weight to that case, and adds more weight to the case for Israeli regime change as well. While Gaza dominates headlines, Israel's foul far-right government is simultaneously accelerating land theft and settlement expansion on a scale unprecedented in recent years. The European External Action Service reports that 2023 saw the highest rate of settlement expansion since 2012, with 30,600 housing units advanced in occupied territory. By May of this year, Israel legalised 22 new settlements in the West Bank, defying international law and further entrenching its occupation. Organisations such as B'Tselem now estimate that over 620,000 settlers reside illegally in occupied Palestinian territories. These actions are not only violations of international law, but are also deliberate attempts to make a viable Palestinian state impossible. Ministers like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir openly advocate annexation and mass displacement, policies that amount to a slow-motion ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Israel's actions are not even confined to the occupied Palestinian territories, though. Its policies are destabilising the entire region through multiple war fronts. In Lebanon and Syria, cross-border clashes with Hezbollah and the new HTS-led administration in Syria have escalated to their highest levels since the 2006 war. In Iran, Netanyahu's government has launched strikes on nuclear facilities, risking significant and further regional war is possible. We know Netanyahu wants to start again with that. So Tehran's measured retaliation to that was notable for its restraint, targeting military rather than civilian infrastructure. In Yemen, the Houthis have blockaded Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea, disrupting global trade as a direct response to the Gaza war. These conflicts are interconnected, and regime change in Israel could de-escalate every single one of them all at the same time. So ending the genocide in Gaza would remove the primary grievance driving regional militancy right now, making it harder for groups like the Houthis to justify continued attacks. They wouldn't need to, would they? Israel's internal political crisis further strengthens the case for prioritizing its regime change as well. Because unlike Iran, Israel retains functioning electoral mechanisms and a significant tradition of political dissent. Netanyahu's judicial overhaul, though, which sought to weaken the Supreme Court's ability to check executive power, has sparked the largest protests in Israel's history. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis, including military reservists and former security chiefs, have joined demonstrations. Legal experts and former intelligence officials have warned that the reforms threaten Israel's democracy and national security. The feasibility of regime change is therefore much higher in Israel than it is in Iran. Netanyahu's coalition is fragile, more so now than ever, as he now has a minority administration, and dissent continues to grow, creating realistic prospects for a political transition in the near future. Iran's regime, we move on to that now, is undeniably an oppressive one. Following the Masa Amini protests, thousands of Iranians were arrested and executions surged to nearly 1,000 in 2024 alone. The Washington Post has described this wave of executions as mass state terror, and Reuters reports that while the protests have been suppressed, popular dissatisfaction remains high. Polling data from the Gaman research group confirms that most Iranians want a secular state and oppose mandatory hijab laws. However, regime change in Iran is unlikely to succeed unless driven by cohesive internal opposition. An externally imposed regime change, as we've seen recently attempted, would almost certainly fail or backfire. Look at how quickly many around the world rallied to Iran's side against Israel as they attacked them. Yet we're supposed to support Israel against global boogeyman Iran all the time, aren't we? Well, it's a narrative that's not cutting through anymore when we can see the truth before our eyes across social media. We know who attacked who first, who had the right to defend themselves here. Iran's regional role also differs fundamentally from Israel's. While Tehran funds militias and supports groups such as Hezbollah, its military actions are largely reactive. So when Hezbollah, or the Houthis, who argue they are more independent, not proxies at all, attacked Israel, these actions were directly linked to Israel's genocide of Gaza rather than to any independent Iranian expansionist agenda. Even Iran's missile strikes on Israel in the last month were carefully calibrated to target military rather than civilian infrastructure where possible. And I say where possible because, of course, Israel build much of their military infrastructure in civilian areas on purpose. Removing Iran's regime might weaken its proxies, if indeed the proxy argument is a valid one. As I said, the Houthis would dispute that. But it would not address the root cause of their mobilization, Israel's aggression and occupation policies. The risk of sudden regime collapse in Iran, the likelihood of that happening aside for a moment, are considerable. A study on the long-term economic and political effects of regime upheavals published on Archive by Cornell University warned that revolutions often lead to decades of instability. And certainly we've seen that in Iran's own history after 1979 and the removal of the Shah. That serves as a cautionary tale. A new collapse could fragment the country again and empower hardline nationalist factions or trigger a prolonged civil war. Or indeed, Western powers could move in and impose a new puppet leader, a new Shah. Goodness knows the son of the last one very much wants this to happen, but he's largely a fringe figure these days, speaking to the likelihood of regime change in actuality. Moreover, removing Iran as a regional counterweight would undoubtedly embolden Israel and the United States, potentially worsening the plight of Palestinians. Why else is Netanyahu so determined to take Iran out, after all? He knows they have no nuclear weapons. He's known it for the last 30 years. He's been bleating that they have. The IAEA knows it. They are signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel have the secret or not so secret stash of nukes here, not Iran. So when comparing the two regimes, the humanitarian perspective should obviously be what takes precedent. Israel is committing genocide in real time. Its fall could end mass killing, starvation and displacement within months. Iran's repression is brutal, but largely contained within its own borders. And while regime change might eventually improve life for Iranians, it would not save lives in the immediate term. Regional stability also hinges more on Israel than Iran. Israeli regime change would ease tensions in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and even Iran itself, reducing the likelihood of a wider regional war. Iran's fall, by contrast, could destabilize the region even further, creating power vacuums and strengthening Western and Israeli hardliners. The feasibility of regime change is another critical factor to consider, though. Israel's democratic institutions and growing elite dissent make peaceful political transition possible. Iran's entrenched theocracy and the Revolutionary Guard's grip on power make any change likely to be violent and destabilizing. And finally, the global consequences of each of these scenarios must be considered as well. Israeli regime change could force a fundamental shift in Western policy, weakening the influence of hardline Zionist lobbies and encouraging a more balanced diplomatic approach. Iranian regime change, however, could strengthen US-Israeli hegemony and embolden further Israeli expansionism and lobbying. The Greater Israel Project would get a big boost, wouldn't it? Both Israel and Iran deserve to face accountability for their respective abuses, but the greater good demands prioritizing the regime actively committing mass slaughter over the one repressing its own citizens. Netanyahu's coalition is genocidal, expansionist, and destabilizing the region on multiple fronts. Its fall would save lives immediately and open the door to a more stable Middle East. As UN human rights experts have warned, the world faces a choice: act to end the unfolding genocide or watch it end life in Gaza. Iran's regime change may one day be necessary for the Iranian people's freedom, but in the calculus of humanitarian urgency, regional stability, and practical feasibility, which ultimately is what people are focused on in the aftermath of the 12-day conflict between these two states, Israel's regime change, again, if either are actually to happen, clearly must be the one that happens first. Zionists are welcome to try and refute that now if they can. But what do you reckon now? Agree or disagree? Have I been too hard on Iran? Have I not been hard enough on Israel, or vice versa? Tell me why in the comments below. Meanwhile, Israel keeps reminding us all of its repression all the more. It's clamped down on aid, even as it supposedly allows aid drops from the skies. They aren't permitting baby formula by boat, though, as the crew of the latest Freedom Flotilla coalition mission have now been seized and taken into Israeli custody. Again, all in international waters. So an act of piracy committed by Israel, just as we saw with the Madeleine before it. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.